Thank you for tuning into the Hacking the Patriarchy podcast. I'm your fervent feminist host, Raven O'Neill, and I get the honors of sitting down with women experts from all walks of life to discuss the ideas, opportunities, and the strategies that women can take advantage of to get ahead in our patriarchal society. So, if one of your love languages is learning how to hack patriarchal systems and structures, I invite you to join us and help move the needle. Today, I'm sitting down with Rachel Anderson. Rachel is an accomplished marketing leader, fractional CMO, and owner of Pivot Studios and the Human-Centric Leader. With 15 years of experience, she drives organizational success through strategic marketing, operational excellence, and human-centric values. Rachel fosters clear communication, collaboration, and data-driven decision-making to achieve impactful change. Committed to lifelong learning and continuous improvement, she champions thriving workplace cultures that balance results with employee well-being. Let's come together and offer Rachel a very warm welcome. Welcome, Rachel. I'm excited to have you on today.
Thank you. I'm so excited too. I've been looking forward to talking to you.
Me too. We're going to talk about team building, which goes hand in hand with the business scale, especially since most people don't think about team building until they need to scale, because the solopreneurs and sidepreneurs, we don't necessarily think about what it looks like to bring on other people. But the second we're wanting to level up, that's the first thing we have to think about. My first question for you is, what are some unique challenges you've seen women-led ventures experience while building and supporting teams in male-dominated startup industries?
Yeah, this is such a good question and a great place to start, really. There's so many different problems that women face, or I guess I should say obstacles, really. Obstacles women face when they're building their own businesses. And then that really translates into, how do I care for someone else? Because it's really hard to make sure that if you're filling up your own proverbial jar, make sure you're taking care of yourself, that then if that's depleted, taking care of other people and building strong and healthy teams can also be really difficult. And so in these kinds of industries, I've seen a lot of different hurdles and struggles. I've experienced some personally. In trying to be in my own venture, build my own business, I've heard men say things like, you're juvenile, or you're free-spirited and should go be free, right? These kinds of things have real weight in the perception of what we bring to the table and how we show up. And it's not all bad or all negative. I've also had them say things like, you inspire me, or I learned something new from you every time we interact. And those things are really meaningful. But when you scale out, how do you take that general female experience and apply that into growing your business and supporting your teams? And so some of the unique challenges I think that women face are including things like overcoming experiential bias. So this is this concept that if it didn't happen to me, then it didn't happen. I think some women also fall into this trap, but I see it largely coming from men. And so how do we give them an insight into what it's really like? How do we build that advocacy from that person and that open-mindedness? Other challenges that women face in building those teams is really thinking through non-promotable work. So as an entrepreneur, I'm sure you're also very familiar with this concept, but I call it the CEO to janitor. We do everything. We're not just the person in charge making decisions. We're also the person that has to make sure the pens are here or the toilets are clean if we have an office or whatever that looks like. And some of these things can be really tricky when we're thinking about how do we advance our teams? How do we take care of them? Making sure that we protect the time and skill that they have, as well as what they can bring to the table. Some other ones is maybe some more practical business ones, but funding is a huge one. I had a conversation with someone yesterday, and it was such a great conversation. And she and I talked a lot about some of the statistics around women-led ventures and what that looks like from a funding perspective. And so I thought it would be a great thing to share here, because you and I were talking a little bit about what this looks like. But women-owned businesses, statistically, the rate of growth outpaces the rate of men's growth by 82% just for revenue. And there's other crazy statistics like 250% for employment. But if we focus in on that revenue piece, since we're talking a little bit about that funding, only 3% of investment funding worldwide goes to women. And that's $107 billion. But investors, if you apply those two things together, are leaving about $43 billion on the table if we make that even with a 50-50 split, and all companies succeed at 100% growth. So that's a huge number for women to not be able to have more stake in the game. And that funding can be a direct correlation to how fast we hire, what kinds of support and responsibilities we're able to dole out, and really shaping the life of the growth of our team. And then some other things like mentorship or knowledge exchange or social kind of expectations as we grow and develop. And then when we become owners and entrepreneurs, we have to fight with some of those social expectations. In some of these ways, I really talk about the ways to overcome is my full coaching experience and what I talk about in human-centric team building. But some of the ways to overcome that I recommend are really strengthening your personal networks, advocating for yourself, and honestly, just having the utter audacity. Sometimes you just have to walk in and say, I'm going to do it. I don't care.
Oh my gosh, that was so juicy. And there were so many points I would like to dive into. I want to rewind to I think it was the first point you made. You talked about a bias, and now I can't, was it experiential bias? Was that it?
Experiential bias.
Okay, that's what I learned was new today. I learned something today because I have never heard that before. I want to dig into that a little bit more because I imagine that male or female having that bias, both in the way you would build a team based on that, but also the way you might look at other people coming in as you build, or even if you're wanting to join a team, how you might bring that and how that might look. And if you, because you brought it up, and I don't know if you've dove into it deep enough to say you're experienced with it, but if you were to use that to your advantage, but also look at the disadvantages, what might you see?
Okay, that is a very juicy question in return. So I think I want to tackle it from two different perspectives. And I'm going to use a female-centric example of experiential bias because I think that for sure can be applied to all genders and people. So I was working with someone who was a director level role. They were trying to build their team, do these different things. And they had a mentor that we both knew, both wildly respected, a female within early tech startup days that just had an incredible CV of experience. And some of her responses to how to build teams, how to have interpersonal connections, what to do in difficult working situations, just blew my mind because the ideas that came forth were more like, well, that's just the way it is. And that's just what you have to do. And it was really unexpected coming from this wonderful woman who we admire and respect so much. And so as I was coaching this director through this kind of conflict between what she perceived and wanted to do as a human-centric individual who really wanted to build strong teams, and then this experience that this woman had, and therefore the information and the recommendations she shared were just at extreme conflict. So I think this is a great example of experiential bias in that if it didn't happen to her, or if it happened in a different way, then it couldn't happen to you, or it would only happen to you in that certain way. And so I think for a lot of women that are trying to grow teams or be on their own, sometimes it's hard to find the right kind of support or the right kind of person that can see and experience outside of the ones that they've held or they've experienced themselves, and be able to think through what that experience looks like from an interpersonal connective perspective, but then also a practical business recommendation perspective. And that's really where that experiential bias comes in. Can you allow space for someone else's experience to be true, even if you have not experienced it, or if you do not necessarily fully understand that experience?
I went through the motions with you as you're talking through it, because when you're scaling and you're hiring, you're probably not going to get a clear gauge of what that future looks like, because we show our best. Ideally, we show our best selves in the interview process and whatnot. So like that conflict wouldn't arise until you were already in it.
And then that can be really tricky too for the person that is looking up, or even the hiring manager, because now you wonder, can this person engage in the culture that I want to have here? Can that person also be trainable or enter in with me to this idea of how to build human-centric mentality? It's really tricky.
Okay, I am going to take the conversation in a slightly different direction.
Right.
And I don't know if this is something you advise on or you dive into, but I think it's super helpful for our listeners that are entrepreneurs that are like, I don't know if it's time to scale, when to scale. And so what, in your opinion, is the trigger, or what should entrepreneurs look for is the trigger of it's time to scale through hiring?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So first, there is no perfect formula. And part of what you have to know as an entrepreneur is, what is my tolerance to risk? There is a ton there of, do I want to be very risky? Do I have the aptitude to stomach the unknown? Or do I only have the aptitude to go baby steps? And neither of those parts, like of the scale, are bad or wrong. So I think it's really important for you to know that about you personally first. Then the second thing I would advise is to know your monetary value in dollars per hour. Even though you may not bill per hour, you may not even be the billable hours person, right? If you are growing and you're the CEO, then you're not the salesperson that you can see that one-to-one. If I do X, then I get Y, right? So that's fine. But the reason I say that is because the easiest way for me to advise individuals on if it's time to grow is if they could pay someone to do it faster or cheaper than what their ability to do it is. And that is not necessarily perfect on a business growth perspective. That should be looked at from KPIs, metrics. That should be looked at from a roadmap perspective. And that's where that risk tolerance really comes into play. But as an individual, if you are wondering, when's it time for me to scale and grow my business because I'm time strapped, or how do I know when to hire the next person on my team? That's the moment. What is your value? And then not value, personal value, but what is your monetary salary value? And then the other thing is a principle I usually use, which actually comes from the real estate world. I used to, back in the day, start my communications career that morphed into marketing in a real estate department at a tech company. And one thing I learned is that once you get to 80% capacity, the room is considered full. Because by the time it takes you to expand, to find a building, to reconfigure furniture, to add seats, whatever that looks like, the rate of hire catches up with the rate of what it takes for you to progress. And so I take the same stance when it comes to hiring individuals and even looking at that big business moment. If you're 80% capacity, that means your employees are working or allotted time 80% totally full all the time. It's time to grow and give them more room. And then that way they don't get towards burnout before you give them support.
I'm laughing because in my head I was like, so it's bad to wait till you're at 110%. Everyone's at 100. Actually, let's roll with that and say that you didn't know the signs, or you didn't, because that is a great formula. You didn't know these things and everyone is at 110%. How do you move forward with that? How do you mitigate it? Because now you've got, it's either yourself for those solopreneurs and they're at 110%. Yep. And again, it's going to take, like you said, that 20% to get back there, to get there. And let's say you do have a team already, and so everyone's at 110%. How would you recommend someone navigate that?
Yeah, I usually use a stoplight mentality. If you have a team, to me, this isn't an urgent team meeting. You get everyone together. You say, frankly, I see the struggle. I see what you're saying. I hear you. I know we need to change. And that really gets everyone on the same page. They know from the get-go, you're trying to do what's best for them. And so it creates this bonded goal. If you're by yourself, you can obviously skip that because the fact that you've just identified it is your own team meeting. That's your own urgent thing. But once you get everyone together, you say, we need to do an assessment right now of all of our activities. What are the things that clearly get us towards our goal? The most important things. We have to keep doing these things. Those would be like green light things. What are the things that we maybe need to give to someone else? That could be yellow light things. That doesn't mean we have to stop them, but maybe you're not the best person to do it. Maybe it's just slant to your role. Maybe it's that somebody else can do it faster. Along with that yellow light kind of area, I would say, what are the things that are nice to do, but not necessarily critical to the business and running it forward? And then I would make a category of what needs to stop immediately or completely change. And once you make these columns or kind of these lists for all of your employees or for yourself, then share them together and look at things from a holistic perspective. Who needs to take over what things? What are things that, yes, this is mission critical, but I don't have capacity. So now we need to shift it to someone else, which might mean they need to shift it. And when I coach teams, these are much, much more successfully done as individual contributors or the team itself having that conversation and not a management top-down decision. There was a story I heard years ago that I just thought was incredibly powerful. It was this group of executives who went on this retreat every year, and they had to set a budget. And so every year, the CEO would let his group of leaders decide for themselves how they wanted to separate the budget, what they wanted to do, who got what quantity. But at the end of the retreat, they had to come back with a number. And one year, budgets got slashed significantly. And that CEO decided, you know what, I don't think that we have the time it takes to do this kind of a retreat because we really need to be lean. So he made the decisions. And that was the first year that none of his executives were able to keep the budget adequately under the budget. They all exceeded their budget levels. And so he never did that again. He was like, that buy-in from each individual stakeholder being able to communicate to their peers what their strengths were, what their needs were, where their time needed to be spent was a critical step to the success of the whole organization. And so that is exactly what I've seen in even this kind of time assessment with teams, when you do realize you're just simply over capacity and big changes have to happen.
What I love about this conversation is that you've thrown out so many practical measures and practical ways to approach things, coming back to how to get back to collaboration. Because as you were talking about this gentleman that didn't hold that meeting, I'm like, how do you deal with disenchantment? Because disenchantment has to come at some point when those things happen.
Disenchantment is a really good word for that. And I want to be honest that sometimes there's not coming back from that. Sometimes things happen in businesses, in teams, in cultures that despite maybe your best efforts, the time has come for someone to leave. And that doesn't necessarily have to do anything with you specifically or the company. And I just want to say it's okay. Like, we often throw around this idea of we're a family, but it's a very one-sided concept. And so part of caring for other people on your team and building trust and authenticity is being able to let them go and celebrate that choice with them. So I think it's okay for certain people to say, I'm not here anymore. And that's an opportunity for you to grow and learn, and then also bring it on other people. Now, if this is a chronic issue, this is something that happened that is continuing to happen, or some major event that happened, I would probably deal with those in a little bit of two different ways. So if this is a major event that occurred and now there's disenchantment, I think an honest reset is important. I typically run my own teams based on team values. And those are team values that are personal to me, but have to be agreed upon by the entire team. And so I typically say, there's a little bit of a formula here of like personal values plus team consent equals team values. So that's a really important step. And for me, I decided that I wanted to value these four things. I wanted to set the expectation with my team that it would always be okay anytime for them to use these four phrases. I don't know, I don't understand, I'm sorry, and I need help. And I wanted those values to set the course of how we interact with each other. So if you think as a manager or an owner about what the values are that you want for your teams and for your company of that interpersonal relationship, how people treat each other and interact, have those conversations in advance, get that buy-in, then when these major moments happen, you come back to that. And so for me as a leader, there are times where I have to go to my team or an individual and say, I'm sorry, you're right. I did not handle this. I didn't do a good job. We need to fix it. And then I seek their advice on what it takes to make it right. So I think that is something that if you have these conversations in advance and you set authentic values, and these can't be like stamped, just replicated because I said so. Those are just my personal values. But like if you have those conversations and you have that expectation, then those kinds of big moments can be fixed. If it's a chronic issue, we have a whole nother set of things that have to be looked at. Is it a process problem? Is it a attitude problem? Because one person can make a huge impact on other people. Is it a listening problem? Is it a skills problem? These are times when I lean into my change management past, and there's this progress of steps that happen when you do change management, and they're sequential. You have to pass each one. And so I would reflect into, is this an awareness problem? Do they know that it's happening? Is it a desire problem? They're motivated. Is it an ability problem? They can practically make a change. Is it a knowledge problem? They understand how to do it. Or is it a desire problem? They just don't want to, or they don't think it's necessary. And so identifying if it's this chronic issue, where on this kind of scale you are, allows you to better address how to fix that and really rebound.
When you gave your values, it felt very empathetic, very authentic was the word, but I had another word for the way. Vulnerable. It felt very vulnerable, but change management is the complete opposite, it feels.
That's right.
So I begged the question in my head, and I made assumptions, which you're never supposed to do, but I assume that in business, the change management is a very masculine approach. The values was a very feminine approach. And how do you determine which one is best for you? Is it that it's chronic disenchantment, or is it just personal preference? How do you determine how you're going to approach the situation?
Yeah. So I think of it like short-term and long-term memory. Both of those functions biologically happen at the same time. And they don't have to be one or the other for them to coexist. And for me, working in your feminine energy and your masculine energy at the same time is what I think creates such a unique way that women win. And for me, saying, okay, if I look at my team long term, what do I want out of this working relationship? What are the things that I want to impart to other people? I desire, in my feminine energy, I want peacefulness. I want joy. I want personal satisfaction. I want growth for me and for the people that are with me. In my masculine energy, I want efficiency. I want transparency. I want to diagnose and have concrete logic. And so for me, pairing those together becomes like long-term and short-term memory. And that one, I'm using as a platform of who I want to be and how I want to operate. And that is long-term. And then the other one is like short-term memory. It is the change management piece where I see that the values and the things I've established aren't working. And now I need to diagnose. And when I need to diagnose, I get very logical and get very masculine so that I can see beyond just that emotional component, how it's making me feel when I'm perceiving my own emotion of what it's making me respond to, which are all really normal and natural things. Trying to put that aside and just seeing the activity gives me a better idea of what I need to do in order to help that other person truly. And sometimes helping them means, hey, we just need to have a conversation now. This is unusual, or this is out of scope of what I think that we should expect. And sometimes it is a very hard conversation saying, you're not doing the things that we both know you're supposed to be doing. There are expectations you're not meeting. And that's a problem for us interpersonally, and it's a problem for us as a business.
I love it. All right. I could continue on this path probably the whole time, but I am going to do another pivot just because we're going down the path of people ops. And I want to look at in the beginning, the team building. Again, we talked about what that catalyst or the measure was for that next step. But what about when you actually go to do it? Because I know as employee one, employee two, or solopreneur or anything, and you go to do that hire, like for me, I'm like, don't do it yourself. But that's just me. I'm like, hire someone to hire the people. Sure. So what would you recommend if a founder came to you and said, okay, I'm ready to scale. How do I actually tackle the process of it?
Okay, this is a great question. So I'm going to try and keep it as action-oriented as possible. The first thing I would do is say, have you made your list? What are the things that when you hire for, you're not going to do anymore. So what are those activities? What are the tasks? Because you should look at that before you assume what kind of hire you need to make. Sometimes, based on the list of tasks, you might need a social media person. Or sometimes, based on those tasks, you might need a virtual assistant who can also do some social things for you. Really looking at the nature of what they're doing is really important. And then those things can basically create a job description. So sometimes we think of it in reverse, where we're thinking of titles. What's the kind of person I need to hire? And then I'll figure out what tasks they have. And I would say that can sometimes cause a little bit of friction for you as a business owner, being able to pass stuff off. From there, when you're actually hiring, I think it's really important to hire for trust and for diversity, if I had to pick two things. And so trust is a little bit of an ambiguous one. For some entrepreneurs that I talk to when they're first starting to hire, I do recommend that they hire trusted friends, colleagues, people they know from their networks, depending on who they are and what their needs are, because it allows them to start the muscle of giving things away. And if you trust that person from the get-go, practicing that muscle becomes a little bit easier. Now, that doesn't always need to be the case. Sometimes you have to hire for someone you just don't know, in which case I think giving them projects that can build that trust initially is really important, and putting together a training program of sorts that allows you to build up to that trust, where you give them the bigger, harder things, can be a really good way to hire. For other entrepreneurs or women that I work with, diving in the deep end is just where it's at. Everyone has some sort of network connection. So get a recommendation, figure out where you want to hire, who you want to hire through, and then just go for it. And as you do that first hire, you'll learn a lot about what you want to hire for and what you don't. So that's where that trust piece, I think, is critical, and how you want to foster that trust or where you want to pull that trust from can just depend person to person. And then the diversity piece, I think, is really important as well. So at first, we really look for people that are similar to us because it feels comfortable. And I think that there's nothing wrong with that as your employee one that's looking for employee two, because it helps with getting speed and rhythm and creating that snowball effect. But I wouldn't do that for very long. I would look at things like who has a skill set that is missing from what is currently available, who has a perspective that does not fit exactly right into my perspective. Meaning for me, I am a middle-aged white female who has tech experience in the marketing department. And so maybe I need to hire for someone who is a mom getting back into the workforce, who is older, who has pharma experience, so that we can round out how the world engages and what we see and how we approach things. And so thinking about how do we hire for complementary diversity and not just the total opposite kind of diversity, I think is a really important way to bring creativity to your team, to bring outside perspective. And statistically, that kind of diversity creates better products. And so if you think about it just purely from a business perspective, not an interpersonal one, by hiring for someone who's different than you, you are setting up your business to make more money.
You said two things that I was like, oh, let's break that down and let's dive into that, because they were both very important. But I felt like there could be like a weird juxtaposition with it. Also, the first one was like a oof for me, which I had never heard someone say, hire someone you know, because there's that trust, which makes absolute sense because there is built-in trust. But at the exact same time, I thought, ooh, what if that friction sets in? Because you see it so often in business when people hire people they know and things go south. I see it all the time with co-founders and married co-founders, and those like that gave me a pause. I'm like, oh, makes sense, but ooh, scary.
It's scary. Yeah. So that is a very common thing. And if I could give managers, leaders, which overlaps with entrepreneurs and CEOs and all that kind of stuff, but this is less about you owning a business and more about you managing people. If I could give managers or leaders one skill set that would make all the difference, I would say conflict resolution. There is no way to avoid some sort of conflict, whether it's you and someone else, It's two people that come to you with a conflict. It's conflict up, it's conflict down, it's conflict with your customers. There's absolutely no way to avoid that. And I think that as the way that the industries, especially the tech industry for me, has evolved so rapidly, and we no longer have 40-year careers at the same place where you get 10 years of management experience under the same manager who can impart and teach you things and give you some of these skills and have that passed down knowledge. That's a skill set that I see as being really absent in a lot of teams and organizations. And so the reason I think it's so important is because conflict goes bad really fast, and it doesn't have to. And so one way to manage that is to get ahead of it. And that's where those like team values come in. If for me, we have team values that say, I don't know, I don't understand, I'm sorry. I'm holding responsibility of myself and others to also share that, which creates trust and vulnerability. And so when conflict arises, you can catch it early. You've already set an expectation of having conversations as adults, as humans. And when necessary, you can pull in other people to help you that all understand the expectation. But that's not always the case. And so in those situations, it's really tough to be working with people you trust because you don't want that friction. You don't want that kind of deterioration. And so I think that having conversations early on in your working relationship about things like, if we have a conflict, what are we going to do to resolve it? What do we want to say right now is how we will mitigate that? And I think it would be even lovely to go as far as to say, what's the moment where we need to ask the question of, should we still be working together? Is it when things get personal? Is it when you no longer want to show up to work? Is it well before that when you realize that there's an imbalance of perceived value, which I think happens sometimes, right? Because one person might become the public face, whereas the other person just becomes the linchpin for everything running. Both those things are incredibly important, but sometimes there becomes this weird juxtaposition of like value because one is visible and one is not. So having some of those conversations up front is how you succeed in hiring people you already know. Now, with that, I'm going to give a little caveat. I think hiring a spouse, hiring a friend, hiring a sibling, hiring that kind of thing, it's not for everyone. That is like a special, make sure that you understand those things, enter those conversations, like love that. In most settings, when I say that, I'm thinking of people you've worked with before that have already demonstrated trust to you. And so instead of just thinking like, I have to hire a stranger, hire someone you already trust. And so I had this boss several years ago who left, and he was beloved. Everyone loved him. He was really great. He was such a good team builder, was just really smart and helpful. And I connected with him a couple years later, and he made this comment to me that I never forgot, which is I always have a mental list of if I have to hire for someone, who are the people that I've worked with before that I would want to work with again. And I think that's a great way as solopreneurs for us to think about, even when we're networking, like I jived with this person so much, I want to talk to them more. And if I get an opportunity, I'm going to see what working with them feels like or could be like. And same with when you have vendors or temporary contracts or even clients. Sometimes I found incredible help from someone that used to be a client of mine, and then off we go. And a couple of years later, I'm like, I want to work with that person again. They have exactly what I need. And I loved everything about the way that they communicated, the way that they produced things, the trust is there, and they go search that out. So I think that there is a little bit of separation there between what kind of trust looks like and the people that give that trust. But both could be possible, but both can also have a lot of tricky things to think about.
And thank you. That clarity makes a lot of sense. Had a few people go through my head. I'm like, oh, she's right. I would hire those people. I'd like to work with those people again. Okay. I have two things that I want to dive in before we wrap this up. And one of them is going back because hire for diversity, because I was thinking, oh, diversity of thought. That is where my head initially went. Hire for diversity of thought. But also when you're hiring for trust, you might not be getting diversity. If you're looking at those two things, trust was number one for you.
Oh, if I could only. Okay. I'm going to say that those things have a crisscross rate in my mind. And I'm going to say this is me personally. When I'm small and I need to grow and I have like precious things to me. Oh, I'm nervous. I'm scared. This is new. I'm like just by myself. I would probably hire for trust over a stranger. Now, trust and diversity doesn't have to be at odds. It could be someone that you already know that you're like, that person has complementary skills. I need them. But in general, I would say trust more important. But the bigger you grow, the more important it is to hire for diversity and build trust. I would say look for the markers of the things that make them a good value fit and hire for diversity, because those values can then build trust because you're from the same playbook. So that's where that kind of crisscrosses. There is a point where I would say that script flips, and the larger you get, the more you need the diversity of thought and experience and perspective.
Yeah, that makes sense. I also had a thought about the whole hire someone you trust, and it immediately went to my thought of when you are a solopreneur just starting out, or you're just on that first skill and you're like, I need to duplicate myself. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I've had that same thought as well. And it's hard because how do you get all the things out of your head to someone else to even be able to duplicate yourself? And so the truth is you'll never truly be able to duplicate yourself. So looking for someone that is another you probably isn't the most successful way to hire and grow your team. What I have done, and there's been a couple of different people that I've learned from over the years. There's one person, I think his name is Dan Sullivan, who wrote this book, Who, Not How. And he talks about dividing your tasks based on your best zone of genius. This is my paraphrase, but your best zone of genius. And then what are these other tasks and how can you hire someone for those things? So I would say that is a great way to start, where if you're looking to replicate yourself, what are the things, and you can even think about it again, going back to our earlier conversation in monetary value, what are the things that I do that bring in the most amount of money, the things that are the most value for the skill sets I have? And then someone else, I should duplicate myself in this 80% or this other set of things that somebody else can do in their zone of genius. So that's really the first thing I would say. And then from there, on the hiring another you front, really tough in the first days of being an entrepreneur to know the right moment to hire that first person that's going to take over things. And it was for me as well. I was really unsure. And so I decided to make the decision purely based off of logic. I had a new client coming in. I said, I can afford this much money. I can afford this many hours to hire another person. I'm just going to start here based on this one client cost. And I'm going to make it work for this one small thing. And then from there, it starts to grow because you become comfortable with that cost. You become comfortable giving them the other responsibilities and tasks. And eventually they become that second you. And then that's how I duplicate all the other pieces going forward, as you look for that same moment of, is it just enough uncomfortable, but can I reasonably do this within the risk aptitude that I have? Then I'm going to go for it. And if it works out, great. And if it doesn't, I think you need to be smart about not trying to force fit it. It's okay to reset. It's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to say, I did my best, but I need to try again.
So practical. Okay. My second to last
point. I'm loving this conversation.
Me too. It's so good. So good. It's a little outside of what we've talked about, but I was listening into a LinkedIn conversation yesterday, and they mentioned a post by a gentleman. He's a big co-founder of a big tech company, and he created a manual for people to know how to interact with him, who he is as a person, how he likes to be engaged. What are your thoughts on that?
First of all, I think that's hilarious. And I love it from I'm all about the SOP, the standard operating procedures. I'm all about like transparency and even who you are and how to engage. So from that perspective, I really love that. I think that there's a few tricky things there that I would love to just have a conversation with him and see, is it working? Do people use that? All that kind of stuff. But I know, unfortunately, that if it's too long or if it's too wordy, then people aren't going to consume that. And so that's my first thing is he calls it a manual, but is it just like a one page or is this like a multiple page situation? The other thing is that when you're in an emotional state, when anybody is in an emotional state, narratives can be established based on their perspective that don't have anything to do with reality sometimes. And I don't see manuals like that as always being helpful in those emotional states because I would assume the manual is about that person and potentially his own boundaries and how he can do his best to help other people work with him. And I love that. But when you're in your emotional state, you're all about your own boundaries and emotions and thoughts. And it's a rare person who's able to just take a time out, assess how this other person wants to be interacted with or this other person's style of working, and then merge those two together to be able to find this solution. To me, it sounds more like he's just establishing team expectations or team norms. And I think that is a great thing. If you say, hey, I'm going to email you between the hours of 8 p.m. and 6 a.m., and I have zero expectation that you are going to respond, then that is probably something that can be said in the manual, but unless it's reinforced, isn't going to stick. But that can be a value. And so I don't know. I have so many questions. This is such an interesting.
I know we're gonna have to like offline talk about it, because what I found fascinating too is he posted it on LinkedIn that he has this manual, and he said he did say it is working for him. But what was fascinating is the flood of comments. They were either like, this is brilliant, or on the other side of that, they're like, oh, you're so full of yourself, you think you needed that. And I was just like, so fascinating.
Yeah. If you find that, you should definitely send it to me because I am very curious about that.
Yeah, I'll get it to you offline. All right. We're getting ready to wrap this up. We've talked a ton about all the things in regards to practical steps you can take to scale, to look at when to scale. Do you have, because I love to end it like this, three tips, tricks to just get it going?
Yes. 3 tips or tricks to get team scale going.
You know what? I'm okay with team scale, or once you're in it, to manage the process, whatever comes to you.
Okay, great. So I would say my first tip is don't do it alone. I think that every entrepreneur, solopreneur, manager, leader, fill in the blank, individual contributor, even no matter where you are, there's a reason for you to need community. And using and having network. And I want to break that down for a second. When I think about network, I do think about the wider network of people that you talk to, maybe it's LinkedIn, whatever. But in this instance, individuals who know you, who believe in you, and have experience that you can rely on. And those are really important distinctions because, like, my mom knows me and believes in me, but she doesn't have the experience for me to rely on in this topic to advise. And so I think those 3 things are really important. So don't do it alone. And they can help you figure out those moments, even potentially before you yourself become aware of, I'm at capacity. I need to duplicate myself. I need to grow and expand, or my team is struggling. So that is the first one. The second one is that I think you should get good at being uncomfortable. We really don't want to expand outside of our comfort zones. I don't either. It's really nerve-wracking. But the place that you can succeed the most is the place where not everything is known, because there's so much more opportunity there. And that becomes team-wide, that becomes individually, that becomes as a business. And it's really about holding on to the willingness to be uncomfortable. And then the final thing is that all of these things, all these tips, these tricks, like building teams, managing your teams, everything, I've seen great success in other people using and adopting and morphing and changing and incorporating it. But I think the one thing that strikes true to me of all these things is authenticity. It's great to mentally want these things or to think that these are good ideas. And that is the first step, is the knowledge and awareness that something could be different. But all of these things have to be authentic to you. So if what you hear me say is, oh, I want my team value to be that you can say, I'm sorry, and you think that's great, there are actual active steps you have to take in order to make that a reality. Otherwise, if you say it, even in the best of intentions, it's not authentic because it's not a real behavior or motivator or value that you have. So think about how you want to grow, expand, build, have teams, and what does that look like for you? Because authenticity is the number one way that you build trust, and people are so smart and so perceptive about when real trust and real authenticity is present.
Brilliant. This has been such a fun conversation. I feel like I thought it was going to go one way. It went a completely other, but so good for the listeners to get all those practical tips, but also hear all the truths about the in-betweens.
Yeah, it's been so much fun. Thank you for just the conversation and having me here. And hopefully it helps someone out there.
Yeah, thank you for joining. If someone is listening in and they want to reach out, I'm going to put it in the show notes, but how do they find you?
Yeah, I am available on LinkedIn. I'm available on Instagram at Make a Pivot Coaching. And I also have a website, makeapivot.com. So I'd love to hear from people. Please do reach out, follow, connect. I'd love to have you as part of my community.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Raven.
Thank you so much for tuning in and listening to today's episode. For all the juicy deets on this episode, be sure to check out our show notes or give us a holler on Instagram at Hacking the Patriarchy Podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support this podcast, don't be shy. Please share it with your friends. Sharing is caring after all. Lastly, if you'd like to lend your personal support, please take a moment to tell the world about it with a review on your favorite streaming platform. We'd be forever grateful. Tune in again soon to enjoy a brand new episode of the Hacking the Patriarchy podcast. And until next time, keep on hacking, my friends. If you've made it this far, I have one more little thing to share with you. Did you know that this isn't my only feminist endeavor? That's right, there's more. I run a media startup dedicated to providing the most current and pertinent news about women, for women, and by women. Our mission centers on delivering a platform where the latest updates regarding women-led initiatives are extensively covered, highlighting women's actions, accomplishments, perspectives, and other elements that profoundly influence women's lives and contribute to meaningful progress. I invite you to head over to femled.news to learn more.